Welcome to this Equine Bodyworkers Guide to the Symptoms of Saddle Soreness. This is part one of two-part presentation. This one's for the examination on the ground. First, we're going to start with the physical signs of saddle trauma. So the most important one for a start is that of muscle loss or atrophy under the saddle and sway back. Poor muscle development under the saddle contact area is one of the most obvious clues to saddle associated soreness. Saddle soreness in itself inhibits the engagement of the abdominal muscles and in doing so prevents the essential lifting of the back by the abdominal muscles. If the abdominal muscles aren't activated and pushing against their antagonistic opposites, the long back muscles, then the long back muscles, such as the longissimus dorsi, are not properly engaged, and as a result suffer from atrophy, leaving hollows in the back line. With both the abdominal muscles and the long back muscles unable to do the work the way they should, the back drops into a sway back lordotic posture through the chest. The horse's chest and abdomen end up largely supported by the spine and its associated ligaments, and the spine acts like a stiff beam instead of being a partially flexible, mobile one. So this sway back or lordosis of the back is really a big key to what's going on. Inhibition of the abdominal muscles with its resulting drop in the thoracic area under the saddle leads to reciprocal raising of the loin too. So the loin or lumbar area of the spine, and leads to that area tensing up and being unhealthy in itself. Quite often this increased lift of the loin is associated with increased muscle bulk in that area too. And some viewers think this is actually a positive thing, when really it is a negative thing and a big red flag that the posture is declining. The spine of the loin usually ends up stiffened and develops arthritis more quickly, and the junction between the lumbar spine and the croup at the back becomes strained with progressive deterioration of the lower back of the horse because things are just not working properly. The whole spine needs to be in a balanced way for it to be healthy. The next common thing that you'll see with saddle soreness is the development of white hairs under the saddle. And this is not something that's consistent with all saddle soreness at all, but it is a bit of a red flag too. So it's another easy telltale sign. The white hair pattern helps to identify where the highest pressure was. Sometimes it's not very apparent when the pressure is first there because it's hidden by the hair coat that's developing or coming through at the time. And it's not until the hair coat is changed that it becomes quite apparent. Quite often it starts as a little bit of a peppering of white hairs, like going grey. I'm way past that, sadly. Going grey-haired as you get older. This peppering gradually develops into a more solid, whiter area if the pressure is maintained and is considerable. There's all sorts of patterns of white hairs that can develop through the back as a result of the pressure under the saddle. This one on the left is the sort of pattern you'd expect if this horse was tensing up the base of its wither under the saddle and pushing against the saddle. And that causes extra pressure under the saddle, both coming from the horse and from the saddle at the same time. So that's that sort of pattern. The one on the right indicates a lot of heavy contact close to the spine. It's a bit back on the wither, suggesting that the front part of the saddle is not really well supported, and that also we've got more dense areas at the front and the back and less so through the center, suggesting that it's bridging. And that bridging could have been partly because the horse was bending up its back under the saddle with tensing under the saddle to cope with that pain, or it could be that the saddle was not equivalent to the shape of the horse's back in the first place. We've got to be careful not to confuse saddle marks from those that are produced by infections along the back or biting from another horse or some other scarring that occurs along the back. This one is extensive, and it's pretty much a no-brainer that it's not just saddle fit issues. This is a horse that's had dermatophilus convalensis infection, most probably what's commonly known as rain scald, or in some countries rain rot, along the spine. And that's left its white marks from the scars from the dermatitis that occurred. Certainly very different, but sometimes if it's under the saddle area, people mistake that sort of infection pattern for that of saddle soreness. If we've got solid white hairs under the saddle, under the contact area that's involved with the saddle, then we're really suspicious that there's been some really intense pressure there. It can cause white hairs in a very short time if the pressure is really quite nasty, or it can develop over a longer period of time if it's sort of moderate sort of pressure. If it's up close to the spine, it's likely to cause local spasm of the muscles, and that's going to contribute to the doubling of the effect of the pressure in that area. This one here corresponds to the sort of pressure that might be exerted by a stirrup bar on a horse that was uncomfortable around the base of the spine, or in a case where there was poor support for the saddle from the tree point and the tree point panel, and it was really resting on the stirrup bar area of the saddle, and thus putting pressure in a fairly localized area on the back of the horse and making it quite nasty for the horse at the time. If we see white hairs over the wither, that is quite commonly associated with rugs that have irritated the horse. It very often is not from a saddle issue. It's rarely from a saddle being too low onto the wither of the horse. It's more common from a situation where the horse has actually got spinal dysfunction, creating an irritable skin over the wither, and then that skin sort of rubs or twitches under the rug, and so between the skin and the rug there's a lot of abrasion, and that quivering under the rug causes the skin to rub against the rug, and if the rug is not particularly smooth, or if it's even moderately smooth, the horse will wear its skin to a degree under the rug, and that will potentially expose the underlying parts of the skin and leave it open for infection. And it can develop infections from this, and sometimes those infections are really acute and get really nasty for the horse. The lower left picture is not one of irritation necessarily to the rug, but a tight rug that's gripped the top of the wither quite nastily and cut in. White patches over the girth area of the sternum are something that you'll see at times. They have different patterns according to the actual way the pressure has been applied there. It can come from over-tightened girths or inappropriate girths. When I'm talking about inappropriate girths, if you put a girth like was on this horse here on the right, that is, say, an anatomical one made for horses with a fairly racy sort of a high-class evented sort of belly, and you put it on more average horse that's got a bit of a pendulous belly, then you'll often get them cutting in just on the edge towards the back and floppy in the front. And so it puts a lot of pressure over a smaller area, and that causes quite a bit of damage as a result. Dry patches are another red flag for too much pressure under the saddle. It can be back soreness that causes, or it can be saddle soreness, or it can be a combination of both. So any of those three situations. It's due to high pressure where the sweat glands are actually shut down from the pressure. The sudomotor activity is the proper medical term, if you like. Too many saddle fitters, sadly, if they've tried everything with their saddle fitting and the saddle seems to be nicely matched and everything seems to be appropriate, they'll just say, well, these things just happen. And that's not true without a good reason. Those dry patches are a real red flag that there is too much pressure there. Quite often, if the saddle is perfectly right, then it's going to be coming from body issues that need addressing or rehabilitating. So it's not something just to ignore and say, oh, it's just something that occurs. It's not something that just occurs for no reason. It's something that needs to be addressed one way or another. Maybe that the saddle, like this one in that lower right picture, and actually the upper one, where the saddle was actually gripping too high in the wither and causing damage and tightness to the wither at any rate. And then probably the horse was tensing under the wither and then adding to even more pressure and things were worse. Those things need to be addressed. So if we move on from what we see as obvious sort of things, let's look at things that we find when we palpate the horse. What might be felt on superficial palpation is hardening or tensing and abnormal enlargement of the muscle of the wither. And the changes are, if they're found, are very significant and suggest damage by the saddle. Abnormal enlargement directly under the skin, and not deeper, but directly under the skin, suggests considerable and relatively acute saddle pressure that has occurred quite recently. The wither shape, when we're palpating, may be found to be abnormal and might be found to be partly dropped, and the nice, smooth, triangular fall to the wither or sloping fall to the wither behind the shoulder blade is not actually there, that it actually has two levels. And according, as you'll see from this diagram on the right, we have the spinalis thoracis muscle, and then we have the longissimus, and there can be a more acute angle with the spinalis and then a flatter angle through the longissimus, and this is actually something quite common. And this is something we find frequently with postural deterioration associated with poor fitness, just not holding the back up well, poor core strength from various reasons, upper thoracic spinal mobility dysfunction, and saddle-related trauma. And it can be a combination of all three of these at once that can cause two angles to exist. So the more acute and then the more sloping one through the wither. And this is a real challenge to saddle fitting in itself. If on the superficial palpation the skin of the wither tends to flick or flinch very readily, like that of a horse getting rid of a fly off its wither, that is much more often associated with upper thoracic spinal mobility dysfunction than primary saddle damage. This flicking itself is considered a paresthesia or abnormal interpretation of the information from the skin sensory nerves by the brain. Successful treatment of the mobility restriction of the spine usually sees this sensitivity settle quite dramatically. If this flicking is extremely exaggerated and the horse obviously very uncomfortable with the touch, it suggests that an acute affection of the tips of the wither is going on. Very often I find this infections of the tips of the wither stemming from spinal mobility dysfunction coupled with the horse being irritated by its rug underneath, as we discussed a little bit earlier, and the horse flicking its skin under the rug and damaging its skin in doing so, leaving the skin bare and exposed to bacteria and acute and painful infections. And they're really super painful. And if a horse is really irritated there, be wary. They can be so upset by it, and it really needs to be helped with veterinary attention with antibiotics quite often to settle it down, because it is a nasty one. It rates a little bit with foot abscesses in horses. Deep palpation of the wither is the next step, and this is one of the most critical steps looking for saddle soreness, because saddle trauma most often affects the deeper tissues more than the superficial one. It gets in deep against the bone. The muscles immediately adjacent to the dorsal spinous processes, that's this yellow prong sticking out of the vertebrae, are usually the most impacted by the pressure of the saddle, and especially so in high-withered horses, and even more especially so once a horse has lost muscle through the wither and has atrophy. These muscles immediately below the top of the wither are the most often impacted by the pressure of the saddle, as I said, in high-withered horses particularly. And the muscle tends to get less as we go up towards the tip of the wither, as the V develops more and more acutely. If you've got a really flat-backed horse, it's less of a problem. If it's a horse like a high-withered thoroughbred that's lost muscle, then a lot of impact is going to happen along this inside edge of the wither, and that's going to potentially, because of the V shape, is going to involve or result in a lot of pressure going inwards. So when we have the pressure of the saddle coming down, it comes down onto the V, inverted V of the wither. A big component or big vector, if you want to go from engineering point of view, goes into the bone and compresses the spinalis thoracis muscle, particularly against the bone. And that's where we find the greatest soreness in horses very often. So as I'm saying here, test for sensitivity by pushing your fingers together. Don't just press softly or gently on the outside, because that's not going to tell you anything about what's happening deeper in. You've got to go further in. The next thing to look for is whether there's any abnormal shape to the wither, whether there's spasm in the rear part or dorsal caudal part of the wither that we see here in this right upper section. You can see the egg-shaped enlargement in that case on the horse in the bottom. It's actually broader right through the wither as a result of the horse just tensing and holding its back tight. My hand is pressed in there and it's made the egg shape more obvious in that top right one, but it was obvious enough in real life without even doing that. And if that's spasming under the saddle, then it's going to be a real problem for the saddle fit if it comes from something else, but it's often associated with saddle-related damage to the ligaments and vertebrae in that area. And it will complicate saddle fitting really badly by sort of pushing from the inside against the saddle that was meant to match to that nicer wither shape that's not occurring. With a combination of a saddle sitting firmly against that and the tightness of the muscle in that area, then you get a cut down of the movement of blood through that tissue and the problems just wind up, because without good blood flow, you get a buildup of heat, you get a buildup of lactic acid, carbon dioxide, they get starved for nutrients, including oxygen, and these tissues really deteriorate. This spasm can be there more on one side or the other, and that's quite a common thing, particularly where you've got asymmetry of the shoulders that is more developed and the saddle's tending to slip one way as a result of that asymmetry. This can occur with riders that are asymmetric or not sitting square in themselves. It's more often, though, a problem coming from the horse than it is from the rider, the research suggests, and my experience suggests. So this can really complicate saddle fitting, and it's something to be really aware of, this area at the base of the wither. If it's not happy, then things are going to go bad in so many ways. And these horses need not only the right sort of saddle, and they need the pressure kept away from the upper part of the wither, but they also need some therapy to deal with that. In some cases where they're spasming and tightening at the base of the wither, you'll actually get a buildup of fluid at the base of the wither that only lasts for 20 minutes or so. And this is not often seen by therapists, but mainly reported by riders, and I have a number of photos of them. I think I've only ever seen one actual live case. Because it disappears, a lot of people ignore it, but it is a red flag to say that the horse is tightening there, it's pushing the vertebrae together in a form of kissing spines, it's potentially damaging the ligaments by straining them when these vertebrae come into abnormal orientation. They should be sitting up and happily and not coming down and the ligaments stretched apart. The circle area there is where we want pressure on the wither, and we want to keep most of the support through that region, right through along through the saddle, based from that spot there. We don't want it up closer to the tips of the vertebrae where the muscle is very susceptible to pressure against it. That flying saucer-like shape above the circle was where this horse was very sore as a result of pressure from the stirrup bar of the saddle, carrying most of the weight in the front, because the actual tree point itself was short and it was high and it wasn't really carrying the weight very well. It was making the horse uncomfortable, and as a result it was bulging more under the stirrup bar And that's where we got soreness with that horse that was really quite nasty. It was verging on extreme. So getting the spine working properly and changing the saddle contact there and actually changing the saddle in this case improved this horse a great deal. If we look at the area immediately behind the wither itself, this can be an area subjected to strain from posture, from soreness from the front of the saddle. It can also be affected by panels coming in too narrowly onto the spine itself, and that can cause pressure and damage to the muscle in that region. It can be because the channel of the saddle is too narrow there, because the twist of the saddle that comes in to allow the rider's leg to come close to the horse. If the twist is too great, then that can actually put too much pressure on that region. So just watch out for saddle soreness or soreness through the back in that region, and look for those sort of things that may be occurring if that happens. Some of the more traditional laminated wood saddles that have springs that reinforce the saddle seat itself and come through and join onto the waist. Some of the steel bands actually come out under the panel just in this area of the back of the horse, and they can protrude a little bit into the panel in some horses and leave a bump that seems to bother horses quite often. So be wary of that with some saddles. It is, when you feel under the panel what the horse is going to be feeling, it is quite nasty in some of the ones that are constructed that way. So be wary of that. The middle of the saddle contact area is an area that's not as affected as others quite often. It used to be really often affected by saddles like this one in the lower picture that had a lot of curve to them and came away at the saddle seat and had curve underneath, so that the horses actually dropped their back to actually, like a brace, to form the shape of the saddle. And this actually gave the rider a nice feel for a saddle seat, but it was no good for horses' spines and led to really bad posture of the spine, disengagement of the hind end, disengagement of the hind leg, hock problems, and you name it were a secondary problem. And it took about 10 years or more for the saddle industry to actually wake up that they were actually damaging horses with this sort of saddle. And thank goodness most saddles are much flatter these days. And it's actually hard to find one of these when you need it for an old horse that really has got a chronically swayed back and would be better in one with a little bit of curve. But for most horses, it's much better to have a flatter saddle that matches their back and the rib cage like you're looking at above. The next in the list of causes for pain in this region is overflocking of the waist of the saddle, especially saddles that have narrow panels through the waist. So, the panels through the waist can be this wide or can be this wide, coming through from the seat of the saddle through to the wither area of the saddle. If they're quite narrow and the saddle fitter is trying to get more support for the saddle through this area, it quite often ends up a tubular pipe that's really uncomfortable for the horse, and it'll make the horse sore through that region and drop its back as well. Ideally, the panel through the waist is reasonably wide and can take flock, and needs to take flock because it needs to bear weight quite well. The ones that are made narrow to fit in with this fashion of keeping the rider's leg close to the horse are really not kind to the horses at all. And it's a really sad thing that fashion determines that when it shouldn't be that way. And the older saddles were definitely not that way, and they were obviously much more comfortable for the horse. Had to be ridden in for many more hours and therefore needed to be more comfortable, but still it's much better for the horse. The saddle seat area, of course, is highly prone to soreness from various things. Muscle spasm is apparent in the saddle seat area from causes like poor core strength, where they're just letting the back drop and they haven't got enough strength to hold up a rider really well. It may be straining their back just from walking around the paddock. If there are psoas muscle issues, then they can drag on the underside of the back and drag them down, and also cause soreness through the lower part of the thoracic cage and into the loin. There can be pain from referral from impingement of the dorsal spinous processes or kissing spines. So the bone coming together, but also, probably more importantly, the interspinous ligament strain that goes along with that. These things are really super common in horses from poor posture that may arise just from poor fitness, or having a really big belly drag on the back, but can arise from saddle soreness, from heavy riders, from pre-existing back problems. So there's lots of things that cause it. And this soreness, though, from a saddle point of view, can be made much worse if the channel is too narrow and is pressing on the spine in this area here. If there's a lot of pressure here, it acts just like the pressure from a wither that is narrow and the saddle pushing in with a vector of force into this region of the back muscles. This is number 3 in this case, is the multifidus muscles, and they're much more sensitive than any others, more sensitive than the spinalis thoracis. And therefore any pressure on those is going to cause tendency for the horse to hollow its back under this area, and damage to those muscles is going to really cause a lot of tendency for the horse to be suffering pain and pushing the vertebrae even further together and develop more in the way of kissing spines. So be very wary of pressure in that area. The other thing that will cause it is if saddle slip to one side. It'll push one panel into this area and this one take the other one away and cause pressure against that part of the spine. If that pressure is maintained and not sort of alleviated, if you like, or not sort of changed with the movement of the horse, if it's maintained hard against that bone, it will cause a lot of pressure damage and cause the horse to be very sore. Let's just go beyond the saddle contact area a little bit to just behind the rib cage, because this is going to be really important, particularly if a saddle is creeping a little bit into the line. If the horse has got a really strong, well-muscled back and is held up nice and straight, this is unlikely to be a sore area. But if it's a horse that's got a bit of a drop to its back or drops under the rider readily, then this area at the back of the rib cage, where this iliolumbar ligament and other muscles join into the back of the ribs, is very commonly sore. And this is a great point to initiate bucking in horses. If pressure is put onto that area or extra strain is put on that area, is something to lead to more bucking in horses. You can see this is the junction here. So we've got the ribs, and then we've got the short ribs of the lumbar vertebrae, which are properly called the transverse processes. These are actually joined by a ligament that comes across here and joined onto the back of the ribs. And it also has muscle attachments, of course, that are all supporting this. Now, if this area is quite tender when you're pressing into it, then it's something to know well about. So you know that saddles, if they do come into that area, are going to cause a lot of discomfort to the horse. The other signs we want to look for when we're doing a saddle check on a horse or checking for saddle soreness is when the saddle is put onto the horse, we want to know, what does the horse seem to think of the saddle? And some horses know which saddle they're getting on them. They'll react differently to a dressage saddle, to a jumping saddle, and some just react considerably to any saddle, because they're all bothering them. The things you'll see are the horses going from calm to being quite anxious or unhappy when the saddle is brought out, to being restless or failing to stand still when the saddle is brought out or placed on its back. It might be flicking its tail. It's looking sort of disturbed with its head. It may, even as it's getting girthed up, kick at the girth or bite at the handle or bite at the rail in front of it when the girth is tightened. And this, like the latter things, can be from dysfunction of the spine, causing them to be quite girthy and tender through the back. But it can be also that the saddle is causing them grief as well. As the saddle comes onto the horse, it's not only the saddle sitting on the horse, but when we tighten the girth, the saddle grips the back of the horse to a certain extent. So it can be that grip as we do up the girth, not just only the pressure of the girth on the lower chest, but also it can be the pressure of the saddle on the top of the wither that's disturbing the horse and making it uncomfortable. So look for those things because they're important as well as the other symptoms we looked at. Sometimes when you put the saddle on and girth it up, the horse may be a little bit agitated and maybe almost stuff you miss. It's an opportunity though to re-examine under the saddle, re-examine the tissues and palpate under the saddle to look for soreness again. Because sometimes the horse might have just enjoyed you palpating it, enjoyed the actual motion of that and like it was getting a bit of a massage. But once you put a saddle on, they have a different point of view most often. And if they've got some saddle soreness there, then those tissues under the saddle often will become more irritated. It will become more tendency to flick, more tendency for the horse to be uncomfortable with your palpation under the saddle. So when you've got the girth lightly done up, put a bit of pressure on the saddle and feel underneath with a little bit of pressure and see what the horse is reacting like. Then it may be quite different to what reacted prior to the saddle going on. So keep that in mind. This sort of soreness, as we know, may be because of poor saddle fit, may be because the saddle is not suitable for the horse, or it might be from pre-existing pain that the horse has got, pre-existing saddle damage, pre-existing spinal damage that are causing the horse to be sore there. Maybe, and often is, a combination of all those things. On behalf of the horses, thank you very much for watching. The second part of this will cover the signs of saddle soreness in the ridden horse.